Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth National Symposium on English Language Assessment, presented by the British Council and TEFLN, with this year's theme, Stronger, More Relevant, More Connected, the Future of English Language Assessment in Indonesia. My name is Francisca Mara Yvonne from Universitas Negeri Malang. I will be the moderator for part one of the symposium. I would like to greet all of the participants today from across Indonesia. We are delighted that you can join this event. Over 1,000 teachers from schools and universities from across Indonesia have registered for today's symposium. We have participants from Aceh, the westernmost province of Indonesia, and to Papua, the easternmost province of Indonesia. Welcome, everyone. Our Zoom webinar can accommodate up to 1,000 attendees, so those who cannot join us in Zoom can join us via British Council YouTube. The committee is sharing the link to the British Council YouTube in the chat box. So if you know any colleagues who cannot join us via Zoom, please pass on the link so that they can join us on YouTube. Before we start, allow me to share some house rules for the symposium today. British Council will record the whole webinar session. By attending this session, you acknowledge that your image and comments may be recorded and rebroadcasted. Please type your questions in the chat box on YouTube by mentioning your name, organization, and city. The moderator will summarize and deliver the questions to the speakers. After the session ends, you will be given a link to complete an evaluation survey. Link to download an e-certificate and materials will be provided after you submit your feedback. Now, without further ado, let me invite Professor Dr. M. Zaim M. Hum to deliver his welcome remarks. Professor Zaim is an academic staff at Universitas Negeri Padang. He obtained the position of Professor of Linguistics in 2003. He currently serves as coordinator of the Doctoral Language Pedagogy Study Program at the Faculty of Language and Arts, Universitas Negeri Padang. Professor Zaim served as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and of Language and Arts, at Universitas Negeri Padang from 2011 to 2019, and he is currently the Vice President of TEFLN. Professor Zaim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yvonne. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon. Honorable the Director of English Education and Society, British Council Indonesia, Bapak Com Downs, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As the Vice President of TEFLN, I am pleased to welcome you to the fourth National Symposium on English Language Assessment, organized by the British Council Indonesia Foundation in collaboration with TEFLN. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the British Council for the continuous support to the field of English language assessment in Indonesia, as is reflected in their dedication to the symposium on the field held over the past 4 years. The theme of this year's symposium is Stronger, More Relevant, More Connected, the future of English language assessment in Indonesia, which I believe is relevant to the symposium's objective. This forum is to gather academic, educational professional, assessment expert, and practitioners to discuss the development of English language assessment that are relevant to the Indonesian context. Through the discussion of the future-ready assessment system to prepare future-ready workforce, the symposium is committed to have enhanced understanding on how assessment build framework and standard for stronger comprehensive learning system. In addition, this forum promotes stronger ties as it would connect teachers, education and language assessment professional to facilitate sharing of expertise for mutual impact between teaching and testing. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for their willingness to share knowledge, experience, and expertise in the field of language assessment. They are Jamie Darnley from British Council, United Kingdom, Shubhan Zain from University of Queensland, Beni Bandanajaya, Director General of Vocational Education, Kementerian Pendidikan dan Kebudayaan, Mary Can, International Labour Organization, Latasha Shafira, Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, Nilawati Hadi Santosa from Atmajaya Catholic University of Indonesia, Anne Fage from British Council, United Kingdom, and Agatha Mikolajewska from University College London. I would also like to offer a special word to thank to the Director of the British Council in Indonesia for working together with TEFLIN, especially in the organization of various academic activities such as seminars, conferences, and symposiums. Last but not least, allow me to express my highest appreciation to all the participants who are taking part in this virtual symposium, and without whom the symposium would not have been possible. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a very successful conference and wonderful time learning from one to another. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Professor Zaim, for the welcome remarks. Now I will invite Pak Kom Downs from the British Council. Kom is currently the Director English Education and Society at the British Council Indonesia. He has been involved in education, specifically language education and professional skills training for over 20 years across Europe and the Middle East as well as East Asia. So please welcome Pak Kom Downs.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you very much to Bapak Zaim. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm looking at the chat at the moment, and I can see many people introducing themselves from different parts of Indonesia. I'm in Jakarta myself at the moment. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon and here together with our distinguished speakers and in collaboration with TEFLIN to deliver this 4th National Symposium on English Language Assessment. I know that today we have English teachers from both universities across Indonesia and English teachers who work in schools in both primary and secondary education. English language assessment is a vitally important part of successful English language teaching and learning. The ability to measure accurately your students' levels of English and give them guidance across the different skill areas is an incredibly important step towards their progress in improving their language proficiency. Over the next 3 days, this National Language Symposium, it really consists of different elements. There are 3 fantastic, more theoretical talks today. So we have 3 sessions for you. I hope that you'll stay with us and have some snacks and tea and coffee and relax and absorb lots of really interesting, useful information. That's our first day today. And tomorrow and on Thursday, we have 4 very, very practical workshops which will help you to improve your practice of assessing your students' levels of English in speaking, reading, writing, and listening. So there's a lot to look forward to. If you don't manage to see everything, then everything is being recorded and you can come back to it later and watch it in a time that suits you and pass on the links of the recordings to other teachers who maybe they are teaching at the moment or they're busy so they can't attend us live. We're really excited to be doing this symposium in partnership with TEFLIN. I wanted to say, first of all, a massive thank you to the former president now, Bapak Joko Nokamto, who was an outstanding president of TEFLN for many years and a great friend of the British Councils, and a big warm welcome and congratulations to the new president of TEFLN, to Miss Ibu Utami Widiati, and to the vice president, Professor Zam, in Padang, a very strong new team to continue TEFLN's fantastic work across Indonesia. And talking of TEFLN's fantastic work across Indonesia, I'm delighted that this first session this morning, or this first session this afternoon, I should say, is moderated by Ibu Yvonne from Universitas Negeri Malang. And Universitas Negeri Malang will be the host of TEFLN's annual conference next year in August in Malang, and it's going to be a hybrid conference. We're going to make it. So I hope to see many of you face-to-face in Malang in August next year, and we'll maybe hear a little bit more about that later today. Let me just finish by saying a little bit about the speakers this afternoon. We've spent a lot of time inviting some fantastic speakers for you. You have really experts in every area. We have leading academics, one of the leading expert in language assessment and language in general from Australia, Subhan Zain, who's going to be in this first session together with the British Council's own Jamie Dunleer, looking in quite a lot of detail at the CEFR and other language frameworks. And in the second session today, you're going to be hearing from different experts. They're going to look at the skills that students need, graduates need in order to get jobs, and the importance of English in getting a job nowadays and in the future. And then finally, in our last session today, you're going to hear from both the British Council, from UK academics, and from Indonesian academics about the growing trend of English medium education and the important role of assessment in English medium education, both for lecturers and for students. So a really interesting afternoon coming up. Please put your comments in the chat, your questions in the chat and in the Q&A box. I hope you enjoy our symposium. I hope that you learn a lot both today and tomorrow and the next day. And I hope to see you all face-to-face in Malang or somewhere sooner. So thank you very much from me, and I'm going to hand back over to Yvonne.
Thank you very much, Pak Hom. Now, before we start the first part of the symposium, I would like to invite all of the speakers and moderators, as well as Pak Zaim and Pak Hom, to turn on your camera so that we can take a group photo.
Okay, so for all speakers and panelists, I would like to ask for you to hold your best smile for our photo today. Okay. Please hold. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Now, we are ready to start the first session of today's symposium. The theme of the first part of this symposium is Stronger Foundation for Future-Ready Assessment System, how standards and frameworks build stronger comprehensive learning systems. In this first session, we will have two esteemed speakers, one from the UK and the other one is an Indonesian but currently teaching in Australia. Our first speaker is Dr. Jamie Dunleer. Jamie is the senior researcher and manager of the British Council's Assessment Research Group. He has a PhD in language testing from the Centre for Research and English Language Learning and Assessment at the University of Bedfordshire. He works on a range of language test development and validation projects for the British Council, as well as collaborating with researchers and organizations internationally. He has over 25 years of experience working in English education, first as a teacher, then in test development and assessment research. So we will learn a lot from Jamie today, because in his presentation, he's going to talk about standards and frameworks, learning from 20 years of CEFR. So the floor is yours, Jamie.
Sorry, it's taking up all my screen. I can't see my PowerPoint to share screen, sorry. So maybe you need to stop spotlighting me so I can just share my screen. I need to go out of full screen, sorry, so I can share my PowerPoint. I can't access my PowerPoint. Oh, okay, I've got it. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint now? Sorry.
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you, everybody. And I'd like to once again thank all of the organizers for inviting me to speak at this event. I was able to share ideas and participate in the 3rd National Symposium last year. And it's a very exciting opportunity to once engage with the community here in Indonesia and to share ideas around how we can improve language assessment and teaching and learning. And that is the theme of our first session here. It is about language teaching, learning and assessment. It's about how standards and frameworks can inform a comprehensive learning system. And if we think about a comprehensive learning system, we can kind of break it down into some really important parts which we can highlight. When we do this, it's always important to remember that we're oversimplifying ideas. There is always a lot more complexity behind diagrams and frameworks. But I think these key concepts are really important in understanding a comprehensive learning system. I've taken this diagram from a publication by Professor Barry O'Sullivan, and you can find that publication on our website. There's a link to it there on this slide. If we think of the whole environment, the learning system, as containing 3 important parts: curriculum, which is what are our goals, what are we trying to achieve, the delivery of that curriculum, which includes everything from teacher training, how the actual curriculum is then operationalized in the class, what are the materials we use, what is the training that teachers have to allow them to actually achieve those curriculum goals. And of course, an important part of that is assessment. How do we evaluate whether we're achieving those goals? How do we provide certification, qualification, and proof for people to be able to take what they've achieved in the classroom out into the outside world? But those 3 important parts of the system need to be joined. They need to interact and they need to build upon each other. Now, this might seem like common sense, but in practice, very often this is not the case, and those links are actually not achieved. Now, these 3 important parts of the system form what we call the comprehensive learning system, but it's really important to think about what sits at the middle of that system. What sits at the middle of that system is our standards, our frameworks. This is how we describe the proficiency that we hope to achieve. Our curriculum goals will lay out our aims, but sitting behind those curriculum goals is the description of the proficiency we would like to be able to achieve with our students, is the proficiency that we need to achieve in order to realize those real world goals for employment, for higher education, for simple communication and interaction. Those standards then inform the delivery. Teachers need to understand the standards. Teachers need to be trained in actually delivering those standards in classroom tasks. Our materials need to be linked, and our assessments need to be based upon those standards as well. So standards really drive the comprehensive learning system, and they sit at its heart. In our case today, I'm going to be talking specifically about a particular example of a set of standards or framework, and it's called the Common European Framework of Reference, the CFR. The CFR is not the only standard available, but it is one with a rich history and a rich set of case studies around its operationalization, its implementation around the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those case studies today. So moving on from the CFR, we can look at what is the history of the CFR. Well, it's 2021. It's been 20 years since it was published by the Council of Europe in 2001. But the CFR is not a set fixed document that is unchanging. In fact, it's recently been published an updated version called the companion volume, firstly in 2018, and then the most latest version of that in 2020. So it's a living document. It's meant to change. It was the original 2001 publication wasn't meant as the full stop in the sentence. It was meant as the starting point. And we are part of that ongoing narrative around the CFR. We are part of its implementation and we are part of its change. And I'll give you an example of how the localization, the implementation of the CFR in local contexts has actually fed back into that companion volume and into the international sphere as well. So although I mentioned from the beginning that we really want to make sure we're talking about a comprehensive learning system, assessment is only part of that. This is the 4th National Symposium on English Language Assessment. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on assessment to talk more about the CFR. And one of the key questions that we have is it useful? Why would we want to use something like a comprehensive set of standards or framework like the CFR in the context of Indonesia? And I'm just going to use as an example a set of examinations which have been aligned to the CFR. On the left-hand side, we see the levels of the CFR, ranging from C2 at a very advanced level through C1, B2, which is a common benchmark for university entrance level proficiency used to study in English medium education contexts, used for employment, used around the world as a common a benchmark level for real uses in the real world of the language, moving down to A1 at an elementary level. Now, recently in the companion volume, there's been the pre-A1 level also added to that framework. Now, these set of international examinations, some of which you're probably familiar with, we have IELTS, Cambridge Main Suite examinations, TOEFL IBT, and on the right-hand side, maybe some examinations which you're not familiar with, but are examples from Asia. So we have the GEPT from Taiwan and the ACAN examinations from Japan. Both of these are very large-scale national examinations that are very, very commonly used and common benchmarks of proficiency within those two national contexts. Now, if we look at the different ways these examinations report their levels, give their feedback to their students, it's immediately clear that they're not transparent. What does a 5.5 on IELTS mean? What is FCE? What is a mark, a scale score on the TOEFL? What is grade pre-1 in the context of Japan? What do these levels mean in practice? And the CFR has given us a very rich descriptive framework around which we can say, well, B2 level of performance, what does that mean? B2 is one of those common benchmarks for university entrance. And it's not just a label. Sitting behind that label is a rich description of what that proficiency looks like. And there's an empirical backbone to the CFR, so it's more than just expert judgment. We can have some confidence that the descriptions of proficiency do increase empirically in terms of the levels as they progress to the advanced level. And now having that sort of common framework, we can start to get a picture of what these different proficiency examinations mean. And this was one of the key aims of the CFR, to provide a common language to describe proficiency, to provide a common benchmark against which we can relate and evaluate examinations, but also curriculum and the delivery of that curriculum in the classroom. Now, let's think about what happens when we take that common yardstick away and we go back to no common framework. When we don't have a common framework, we suddenly go back to that very non-transparent system of what do these levels mean in practice. So having that common framework really gives us something around which we can peg our descriptions and understand each other when we talk about B2. Now, these all come with a health warning that levels of proficiency alignment by examination should not be taken at face value, and you should demand to see the evidence which underpins that alignment. Now, I've been talking about international exams, but if I zoom in on Japan, where I worked before I joined the British Council, and I worked for ACAN as the chief researcher, the CFR provided us with a really powerful tool. It wasn't mandated or forced by government. It was something that we picked up because, as well as allowing us to talk to international educators with a common language to understand what grade pre-1 meant for them when we could describe it in terms of the CFR, it provided that within Japan too, because it became very clear that many of the goals in the curriculum were implicitly understood. We want students to have a proficiency equivalent to what they would get for graduating from junior high school. But what did that mean in practice? It became clear that we needed a common language to describe proficiency even amongst ourselves as educators within Japan. And the CFR really gave us a rich tool to be able to flesh out exactly what we meant by grade pre-1, grade 2, or other benchmarks in the curriculum like graduation from high school, graduation from senior high school. What do they mean in practice? Now, one of the questions that we have with the CFR is always, yes, but how far can we stretch something which is an international, or even people say, well, it's the common European framework of reference. How far can we stretch a global framework or set of standards to local contexts? Well, what I'd say is that this is not a yes or no choice. It's not locally appropriate or globally neutral. It's actually it's a continuum. And the balance between locally appropriate and globally neutral, it will change depending on the stage of the education system we're discussing. It will need to change depending on the level of proficiency we aim or the uses with which we wish to put that proficiency. So this is a continuum, and we need to move the balance for a particular examination, a particular set of curriculum goals and aims, or how we achieve those goals and aims. We need to move the balance along that locally appropriate to globally neutral continuum. It's not a black and white decision between local or global. It will depend on the context and the users. Now, some descriptors within the CFR, the rich description I mentioned, we have these descriptors which are aligned with different levels of proficiency. Some descriptors which give examples of what a learner at that level can do don't travel well, and this is true. I'll give you an example from Japan. There's an A1, very elementary level descriptor, can write a short, simple postcard. This has been changed slightly in the most recent version of the companion volume to can compose a short, simple postcard. In the context of Japan, postcards are very formalized forms of communication, often exchanged between, for example, employees at a company and their managers, or also sort of formal relationships that are exchanged at particular seasons, use seasonal language. And very often people would say, well, this is not an elementary task. This is not something junior high school students engage in, because postcards are actually a very formalized method of communication. This descriptor did not travel well in Japan. It got a lot of attention, but it's one descriptor. In the original CFR, there were over 250 descriptors. One descriptor didn't travel well does not mean that the backbone, the core framework, the foundation didn't. And in fact, we found that the majority of those 250 plus descriptors did travel well and gave us that rich tool that I mentioned that we needed to be able to talk to each other in the context of Japan, but importantly, particularly at the university level, to talk to people outside of Japan in an international communication context and understand proficiency. Some descriptors don't travel well, but it's important not to only talk about those and to think about the ones that do travel well. And if we look at I mentioned that, it's always going to be a balance on the continuum, and how we make that balance in terms of what's locally appropriate or globally neutral. Well, actually, there's some hints in how we need to do this and what the balance would look like by looking at the description of proficiency in the CFR. If we look at A1, elementary level of proficiency, and some of those key words which describe proficiency there, I've highlighted in black, they're bold and underlined them, so you don't need to read the entire text. But some of the key words and concepts for A1 are familiar, everyday, basic phrases, ask and answer questions about personal details, interact in a simple way. So you can see the key words here are very much about the familiar, everyday, simple, personal. It's that foundation level of basic communication. Now, when we move up the scale to a more advanced level, the B2, which is commonly used, as I said, for example, university entrance level proficiency to study in English medium contexts, we see different keywords and contexts. Complex text, concrete and abstract topics, a degree of fluency and spontaneity. So we see the ability to break out of your own local context and to be independent as a communicator, to be able to deal with unfamiliar contexts, and to be able to interact on a much more rich kind of set of contexts around education, around employment. And we see those keywords there. So what does this mean for our balance between locally appropriate and globally neutral? Some key ideas here: pronunciation, topics, situations, vocabulary. All of these things are contained within a very good set of standards like the CFR, descriptions of what these mean in practice. Locally appropriate, well, we might need to adjust the balance for locally appropriate when we're talking about A1 or pre-A1. And I mentioned key words there like familiar, everyday. Familiar and everyday for junior high school students in Japan is going to be very different for junior high school students in Indonesia, or indeed junior high school students in the UK. So at a very low level, and in basic education, we may very much need to think about the balance being more towards locally appropriate. But when we go to higher levels of proficiency like B2, we're thinking about accessing information from global sources. We're thinking about interacting with speakers from a range of contexts and adult learners. Here, that B2 level of proficiency in a global framework is very relevant, and the need to localize or change that, I think, is much reduced because our aim is to use language in a global context. So just to finish up now, to wrap up, I'd like to just talk a little bit about that idea of localization and some very good examples of how it's been done in practice. I've talked a lot about Japan because it's a context that I spent 20 years working in Japan before I joined the British Council. A very good example of localization is the CFRJ. This was developed because in the Japan context, there was a need to provide more granular levels of description in basic education and in school. And so they spent a very long time developing the CFRJ, and it's a very good example of how to do this kind of localization in practice. What's important to see here, though, is it's still the CEFR. It's localized in providing more granular descriptions of proficiency, but the key concepts, the framework itself, is still the foundation of what is being used. It is aligned and it comes from the CFR. The CFR is at its core as a framework. And in fact, work done by in the Japan context on pre-A1, developing descriptors to describe that level of proficiency for true beginners before A1, has now fed back into the international context. Pre-A1 descriptors developed in Japan, a local context, are now being used in the companion volume. And so they are relevant for a global context as well. So that interaction between local and global is not just one way, it's an ongoing discussion we have as we implement the CFR. And it's not just about Japan or indeed Indonesia or other local contexts. Within Europe, the CFR is indeed adapted within local contexts. And there are many good examples in what's called the European language portfolios of how this has been done in practice. So yes, we need to adapt the CFR, not adopt as it is, but that adaptation is using the framework as a core because that gives us the strength of a rich descriptive framework to understand proficiency. And the last thing I would say is it's not easy. These examples give you very good case studies of how it is done in practice, but it requires commitment, dedication, collaboration, and a great deal of work to do that properly. But the CFR is what gives us the strong foundation, I believe. It's one foundation, it's not the only one available in the world, but the 20 years of experience we have working with the CFR means that it is one that is very useful and gives us a rich tool to be able to understand our local contexts and communicate across international contexts more effectively about our education systems. And that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jamie Dunley, for reviewing CFR, how this standard of reference can inform language teaching and assessment, of course, and how it can be localized to the needs of different countries. Now, we are going to keep the questions for later, after the second speaker. I would like to invite the audience to send their questions to the Q&A box or to the chat box, and also to the chat box in YouTube. Now we will listen to our second speaker, Dr. Subhan Zain.
Hello, everyone.
Subhan Zain, PhD. Good afternoon, Pak. Subhan Zain, PhD, has recently assumed a lectureship position at Australian National University. He is the author of Language Policy in Super Diverse Indonesia, Routledge 2020. Pak Subhan Zain is Asia TEFL Director of Research Publications and Principal Investigator of the British Council's English Across Asian Education System Scoping Research. in 2020 and 2021. He has recently been named Australia's most top researcher in English language and literature in 2021. Congratulations, Pak.
Thank you.
Dr. Zain's presentation today is on working principles of the General English Proficiency and English for Teaching Proficiency frameworks. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Yvonne. I would like to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen here?
Yes, Pak.
Is it clear?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Can everyone hear me clearly? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings to you all. Before I start, I would like to say thank you to the symposium organizers, Ibu Farida Limbong and Pak Comdowns of the British Council, for scheduling my talk. I also would like to thank British Council as an organization for providing me with a research grant for the English as a subject in basic education in ASEAN, because this presentation is based upon that project. Secondly, I would like to welcome all the audience, TEFLIN members, students, teachers, researchers, and scholars. Today, my topic is working principles of the General English Proficiency and English for Teaching Proficiency framework. This topic is a follow-up of a presentation in the TEFLIN conference that I did 2 months ago. It expands on the ideas I presented there and adds new ones. So here's the overview. There are 3 sections of this presentation. First, I will talk about the CFR as a short gap measure. Of course, by the CFR here, it is common European framework of reference for languages. Second, I will talk about the working principles of national frameworks on English proficiency. Third, I will conclude the presentation. Okay, let's move to the first section, which is the CFR as a short gap measure. To understand the context, I need to tell you that for many decades that we have been teaching English in Indonesia, we don't have a national framework on English language proficiency and teacher standards. For years and years and years, lecturers and teachers alike have been using TOEFL and IELTS in order to measure English language proficiency. Some universities have even developed their own versions of TOEFL and language proficiency tests. Recently, there has been a suggestion to develop a national framework of English language proficiency. This has been put forward by Professors Willy Renandia, Fuad Abdul Hamid, and Joko Nurkamto. They published an article in the Asia TEFL Journal in 2018, and they made a convincing argument about the need for a framework, as you can see here. They also argued that there is a need to reevaluate TOEFL and IELTS. TOEFL and IELTS are indeed popular. However, they are not representative of teachers' ability to use English in the classroom. Professor Renandia and colleagues state that TOEFL and IELTS may not be the most accurate measure of one's ability to use English for general communicative purposes, much less for language teaching purposes in school. Certainly, this statement is true. Secondly, instead of TOEFL and IELTS, they suggest that we adopt the CFR. This suggestion is based on the use of the CFR in other ASEAN nations, such as Malaysia and Vietnam. The minimum standard which they suggest is a B2 level of the CFR. When suggesting the use of the CFR, Professor Renandia and colleagues suggest that we need to learn from the experience of other ASEAN nations. So the question here is, how do other ASEAN nations implement the CFR? The findings from my research suggest interesting things, and I would like to share them with you all. First of all, not all 10 ASEAN nations use the CFR. In ASEAN, only a few countries use the CFR. Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines, and Myanmar do not stipulate English language proficiency standards for teachers in the CFR or any standardized test. Indeed, These countries have no national language policy on English teachers' proficiency. 2 other countries also do not use the CFR. They are Brunei Darussalam and Singapore. The 2 countries use Cambridge's General Certificate of Education, GCE. There are 3 countries in ASEAN which use the CFR. They are Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. In Malaysia, the proficiency standard set for English language teachers is C1 on the CFR framework. This is based on Malaysia's English language roadmap 2015 to 2025. Meanwhile, Thailand has different levels of proficiency for their teachers. Those teaching in primary education are required to have the proficiency level of B1. Those teaching at secondary level are required to have a B2, and those teaching other subjects to have an A2. Vietnam is also different. The government of Vietnam has required teachers at upper secondary schools, that is grades 10 to 12, to attain a C1 level, while those teaching at primary and secondary levels need to have a B2 level. Now, let's move to an important part of our discussion, problems with the CFR-based policies in ASEAN nations and with the CFR itself. The main problem with the CFR relates to CLA-based criticisms. And by CLA, that means second language acquisition. So there are many research studies in second language acquisition that are critiquing the CFR on the basis of theories and principles. Given the time constraints, I certainly cannot discuss them all. If you are interested, you may refer to the research of Professor Jan Halsten of University of Amsterdam. In some of his works, he stated that there is lack of empirical evidence justifying the CFR scales and descriptors. According to Professor Halsten, there is no empirical evidence that all L2 learners at a given level beyond level A1 are able to perform all the tasks associated with lower levels. This is one of the many SLA-based problems which the CFR has. Well, of course, there are also many studies suggesting the contrary, and that's part of the debate. Second, the CFR does not cater for translanguaging. What is translanguaging? My definition of translanguaging is simple. It is the flexible use of features of different languages as one linguistic repertoire. In translanguaging, we see what we call languages, L1, L2, and L3, as one linguistic repertoire, rather than separate linguistic systems. Thus, when we say something like, "Buset dah, gua kagak ngerti dah what you're talking about," bicara yang mudah dimengerti saja lah. So when we say something like this, it is not that we're talking in code switching in 3 languages, Betawi, English, and Indonesian. Rather, we use linguistic features from what we call 3 languages as one linguistic repertoire. In code switching, they are seen as separate. In translanguaging, they are not separate. They are unitary. Now, what does translanguaging have to do with the CFR? An examination of the CFR descriptors will show that translanguaging is not catered for. In the earliest version of the CFR, which was developed in 2001, it came before the emergence of translanguaging, which gained prominence in the 2010s. Even the newest version of the CFR does not incorporate translanguaging. It does not say anything about how to cultivate L1 for L2 learning, or how to use L1 and L2 effectively for L3 instruction, or how to cultivate L3 instruction for L1 and L2 development. For this reason, the CFR is problematic in terms of translanguaging in the Indonesian context. And that's because people in Indonesia already speak Indonesian, Javanese, Sundanese, Batak, Minangkabau, and so on. So the big question remains, how do we measure teachers in this context? How can they use different languages appropriately for English instruction? Now, the third problem. The CFR places an emphasis on language proficiency based on the native speaker model. Therefore, the focus is on accuracy. However, there are new approaches which are set against native speakerism. Approaches such as English as a lingua franca focus on intelligibility. ELF is against native speakerism. Indeed, there is a prevalent resistance to native speakerism in ASEAN, where ELF is a preferred perspective. 2 months ago, in his TEFLIN talk, Professor Fuad Abdul Hamid followed up my suggestion that Indonesia is currently transitioning towards an ELF model rather than EFL model. So in other words, it's moving away from EFL towards ELF. The use of the EFL and ESL models is no longer validated by current research. We are transitioning towards the use of English as a lingua franca, which does not rely on the native speaker norm. How ELF is incorporated into the CFR is still a dilemma. We still don't know. And to resolve this issue is one of the radical conceptualizations needed in SLA research, as Professor Tim McNamara suggested. Now, as far as the experiences of other ASEAN nations, we will find many problems. First, the CFR is set with unrealistic expectations. In Malaysia, there is limited time allocated to students' learning hours, but the expectations are so high. A similar case is found in Thailand and Vietnam. Findings from these two nations demonstrate that the required CFR levels may be too high for teachers. Here are two comments from Thailand and Vietnam participants. Next problem. In its original conception, the CFR in Europe was intended for the development of plurilingualism. This means mastery of different languages at different levels of proficiency. So this means that you speak Indonesian, some Javanese, a little Bakumpai, good English, and so on. As far as plurilingualism is concerned, the adoption of the CFR in Malaysia and Thailand has been done without carefully considering the plurilingual agenda. Indeed, the CFR in Malaysia and Thailand focuses on the monolingual ideology. It places emphasis on the acquisition of English only, rather than plurilingual abilities to master English, national languages, and indigenous languages. What about the Indonesian context? Plurilingualism is the norm in Indonesia. In many contexts, English is learned as an L3, given that students speak an indigenous language as an L1 and Indonesian as an L2. In some contexts, English is an L4 and L5 because students already speak a second, third, and fourth language in addition to Indonesian. If we want to implement the CFR in Indonesia, we simply don't know how it would cater for the plurilingual reality of our nation. The next problem is related to curriculum misrepresentation. I mentioned earlier that the CFR is excellent in its concept to align language proficiency and language curriculum. Unfortunately, the problem is that the national curriculum has often been developed prior to the adoption of the CFR. Consequently, there are mismatches between curricular contents and the CFR descriptors. There's also misalignment with assessment and learning transition. In Malaysia, data suggests that teachers don't know how to assess students according to different CFR levels. If they don't know how to assess, they know less about designing teaching materials catering for different learners. So materials are often unsuitable to learners' level. As a result, materials are unsupportive to learning transition. They do not help learners much to move from lower levels to higher levels. In Vietnam, the CFR requires the use of more communicative approaches to assessment. However, this makes little difference. Participants in my study have also suggested that the CFR is not contextual. Indeed, the CFR is Europe-based, although it is argued to be applicable in various contexts. Given this situation, some participants of my research have suggested that we need to develop a regional-based framework. This is what the CFR is lacking. It does not cater for regional contexts. In ASEAN, we already have CTCF. What is CTCF? CTCF stands for Southeast Asian Teachers Competency Framework. It has been developed by ASEAN member states as a framework of reference for teachers in the Southeast Asian region. Indonesia, as a member of ASEAN, needs to follow CTCF. The framework uses 4 dimensions of teaching, and these 4 dimensions are know and understand what I teach, help my students learn, engage the community, and become a better teacher every day. Finally, the last problem has to do with the insufficiency of the CFR for teaching purposes. Data from my research suggests that pure adoption of the CFR is impractical to teaching English because it is mainly about language use. The CFR does not measure one's ability and skills to use the language to teach. Here's a quote from a Vietnamese participant, which shows that even a C1 CFR level is still insufficient. As you can see in the comment, the participant suggests that for teachers, there are 2 kinds of English. One is English use in general situation, and the second one is the use of English in the classroom. Given the problems above, I argue that we should not stop at the CFR. Does that mean we shouldn't use it at all? By all means, no. The policy is already underway, so we need to continue what has been done. We shouldn't dismiss the effort that has been made. However, the problems above show that the CFR is only a means rather than an end in itself. This means that it is best used as a short gap measure because we don't have any proficiency standards at the moment. In the meantime, we need to work to develop contextually relevant national frameworks of English teachers' proficiency, which leads us to the next section, national frameworks on English proficiency and their working principles. The premise here is that teachers' English proficiency requirements need to go beyond simply the CFR. It is not about adopting the CFR or other frameworks. It is about creating framework which can treat the issue of teachers' English proficiency in a holistic and systematic manner in a way that is contextually relevant to an ASEAN nation. So here I have a two-pronged approach to English language proficiency. So what are they? The first one is general English proficiency, and the second one is English for Teaching Proficiency Framework. The general English proficiency framework is intended for students and teachers. The premise is that whatever proficiency descriptors that students can handle, the teachers need to do the same or even more. Let's go to some details. General English proficiency framework is about the use of English language in general situations. It is about the use of English in situations other than teaching. For example, the use of English to book flight tickets, to order food, to ask for directions, and so on. The English for Teaching Proficiency framework, on the other hand, extends on the general English proficiency. It has specific domains and references pertinent to the skills and abilities to use English for teaching purposes. Teachers cannot just demonstrate proficiency in general or academic situations, like what IELTS, TOEFL, and the CFR require. They also need to demonstrate abilities to use English to facilitate learning. English for Teaching Proficiency framework works on the premise that teaching tasks are all implemented in and through language. This means that the framework is a form of knowledge for teaching. To understand the scope of general English proficiency framework, we need to understand its working principles. I'm not offering specific descriptors. Rather, I offer working principles, and these working principles set a guidance for the framework to operate. So the first one is that general English proficiency framework has domains, anything in life outside the domain of teaching. This includes domains such as personal, social, educational, occupational, and spiritual. Secondly, the general English proficiency framework adopts So the same SLA research principle with the CFR. It distinguishes language activities. So these include the use of language in reception and production activities. So you know there are receptive and productive skills, right? So in our general English proficiency framework, we also have them. We also have those receptive and productive activities. And we also have interaction and mediation activities. Next, the general English proficiency framework embraces new perspectives in applied linguistics. So for example, we have plurilingualism. However, we also have ELF. ELF does not adhere to the native speaker norm, so that an adoption of the ELF in the framework means that we only need to focus, right, to prepare learners and teachers to be able to understand and be understood by interlocutors when they are in a situation to use English as a lingua franca. And the CFR focuses on monocentric English, whereas our framework focuses on pluricentric English, where the use of different indigenized varieties of English is acknowledged. Therefore, the framework incorporates varieties of English, such as Singapore English, Philippine English, and so on. It does not solely focus on American or British English. The framework also includes parameters which shape language use. The context, the text type, themes, condition, and constraints must all be considered. And then dimensions of language use must be comprehensive and included. So that's why we also have intelligibility, fluency, complexity, appropriacy, and capacity. The final two working principles are as follows. The first one is it includes different competencies, including such as general and communicative competencies. And then it shows the alignment between syllabus, curriculum, assessment, and textbook. So what I really like about the CFR is the integration between curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. And that is the principle that we also have in our framework. And then now let's move on to the English for Teaching Proficiency framework. The framework here has got some working principles. The first one is that the framework reflects teachers' understanding of syllabus, curriculum, assessments, and textbooks. In other words, it's the alignment between curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Second, the framework needs to include translanguaging. If you are familiar with the work of Professor Donald Freeman and colleagues, they have recently developed a new idea called English for Teaching. Even in English for Teaching, translanguaging is not included. In our adaptation of English for Teaching from Professor Freeman, we would like to include translanguaging so that we know for certain how teachers can use Indonesian, how they can use indigenous languages to teach English. That's the basic idea. And then, the next one is scaffolding, right? So scaffolding is basically about providing assistance to learners in a gradual manner until they can do tasks independently without assistance. And then the next one is the framework needs to incorporate the CTCF. For example, CTCF is related to language that represents dimension, such as helping students to learn, which is basically about the promotion of learning autonomy. If we include CTCF in our framework, we know that there are certain words, phrases, or expressions which can be used specifically to help students learn, to encourage their use of different learning strategies. The next principle is the inclusion of language for teaching aspects. And by teaching aspects here, these are elicitation, repair, providing rich language input, providing language models, right? And then providing accurate and thorough explanations and the ability to improvise. So I'll give an example about eliciting information. When a teacher wants to elicit information from students, she or he may want to invite students to participate by asking questions such as, what is the meaning of X? Does anyone know? Or what else? What is related to X? So these sort of questions are related to elicitation. So our framework needs to be able to cater for this. And then in terms of language input, in terms of language input, it is not only about the use English as the sole medium of instruction, but also the use of Indonesian and indigenous languages, right, in a complementary manner, which can provide rich instruction for English. And then this leads to the idea of language models, right? The teacher needs to use the language to provide different models. So it's not just American or British English, but also other varieties of English, such as Singaporean English, Malaysian English, and Philippine English. Now let's move to the next part, which is language management. So the use of language for classroom management is important because it allows a detailed and up-close understanding of the local teaching context. It focuses on the use of appropriate register of English for classroom teaching in consideration of the complex relationship between teacher language, classroom interaction, and learning. So the language for classroom management has different facets. These include dividing tasks, units for lessons, assignments, assigning role of students, controlling interaction, giving order, prohibition, and encouragement. Do I still have time, Yvonne?
No, but actually,
okay,
we are
okay,
running.
I'm sorry, yes.
Right.
So I'll just go further to the next part, which is intercultural language teaching. So as you can see here, with intercultural language teaching, the framework will include the idea of teacher creating context for intercultural learning, noticing and questioning intercultural differences, comparing and contrasting intercultural differences, drawing connections between different cultures, and translating and interpreting intercultural points. And the last bit is including digital technology. We cannot deny the usefulness of technology. And for that reason, then teachers will need language that can help them to mediate synchronous CMC and asynchronous CMC. And they also need language that can help them to set up tasks and activities using digital resources, to assign students to utilize digital resources for learning purposes, and to conduct assessment. So this is the graph that I have. This is a diagram that I created. English for Teaching Proficiency Framework is outside, and General English Proficiency Framework is inside. So the inside circle is General English Proficiency Framework, and everything is included within English for Teaching Proficiency Framework. And that's the conclusion. First, we need to use the CFR temporarily as a shortcut measure. In the meantime, we develop national frameworks on General English Proficiency and English for Teaching Proficiency. And then there is a need for big collaboration here in the development of descriptors of the framework's working principles. I'm very sorry to take up your time. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zain, for the comprehensive analysis on the needs to develop the national frameworks on General English Proficiency and English for Teaching Proficiency, and how focusing on some working principles on the use of language in general and in teaching context is very important to be done in the development of these tests. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Jamie and Dr. Zuhan to answer some questions from our audience. The first question is from Nurmala Elmin Simbolon. Dr. Jamie Dunley, it's very useful sharing about the assessment framework. Thank you. I have many questions about CEFR for quite some time. So 3 of my questions at this point are, what would you recommend on the level to start to adapt the CEFR in Indonesian context? Is it from school level or higher education level? In Indonesian primary and secondary, new curriculum just mention CEFR as one tool on English subject assessment, but seems it's not implemented yet. So that's the first question. The second one is, would you share one strategy to pilot the CEFR adaptation in school level or higher education level? So.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So I think one thing to think about is that we don't just think about the CFR, we think about each of those levels as being appropriate for different uses. And as I pointed out in my presentation, that at the lower levels, the A1, and particularly what's new in the companion volume, the pre-A1 levels for absolute beginners, it is very much important to think about that local context, and adapting is a really important feature there. And that's what the example of the CFRJ I gave was very much focused on, and also the European language portfolios. It's important to remember that Europe is not one same context either. The European language portfolios very much were focused on basic education, and that's where we really need to think about adapting, I think, at the A1 level, the A2 level. As we progress though, and I think moving up from B1 into B2, we need to always think about what we're using the language for. And in local contexts where the language, even at a high level, is being used for internal purposes, yes, very much that context that we were talking about translanguaging and using multiple languages, it's very, even at an advanced level, it may be important to consider that local context. But if at a B2 level of proficiency for university, for example, the main purpose is to access a range of sources of information in international context, or to speak with students, not from America or the UK, but to speak with students from Taiwan and China and Japan and other ASEAN countries in a common language, then we do need a internationally focused set of descriptors which are consistent across those contexts. So I think it depends on the level of proficiency, but I also think it depends on the uses to which you apply those levels of proficiency. But basically, as we go up, I think it becomes more about having a common set of standards and understanding of proficiency which can join contexts rather than being specific to a local context. Whereas at the lower levels, we're very much talking about something that's in the classroom and is everyday and familiar.
Okay, thank you so much, Jamie. Now, the second question is for Dr. Subhan Sain from Ibu Martini. The material CFR for me as senior high school teacher of English are too high or complicated. As a teacher of English, I'm curious, what materials and how do we teach the materials to reach the minimum standard of English skills, of English language skills? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, this just proves the idea that I introduced earlier, where the curriculum has been conceptualized, right, prior to the introduction of the CFR. And the materials are also prepared, right, before the CFR, which means that there are, discrepancies. And then when they would like to use new materials from overseas, and this is happening in Malaysia, then the same problem occurs. The materials, the textbooks are just too high. Students don't really get it. There are cultural inappropriacies, some texts, some ideas presented in the textbooks are not locally appropriate, not culturally appropriate to the Malaysian learners. So that's a big issue. The biggest problem that's currently faced by many countries in Asia that introduced the CFR is exactly this one, right? And to have the short answer to that, my answer is I don't know, right? If you're asking me directly the level, then I have no idea, right? My estimate, I can only give you an estimation that generally it's level B2 and B1, between B2 and B1, right? And this is based on the policies in other countries, right? So these two levels are generally used in Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia for students at high school level, right? For Indonesia, as far as I'm concerned, the last time I heard, policymakers, the Ministry of Education and people in Teflon are still working on this issue. So we're still waiting for the current update.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes.
Now, I think we are running out of time, so those are the only two questions that we can answer, but there are more questions in the Q&A box. So if Jamie and Pak Zain want to look at it, the questions and answer them, please do. Okay, now.
Pak Jamie, you can go first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. No, yeah, but you can just type the answers later. Okay, now because we need to break and then go to the next session. So thank you very much once again to both our speakers today for the first session, Dr. Jamie
So
Dunley
no
and
answering
Dr. Subhan
session
Singh.
here.
Excuse me?
So
Huh?
there is no answering session for 2 more questions, or do we do that
Mm.
individually?
In the chat. Yeah.
In the chat,
Okay,
in the
alright,
chat
sure.
box and Q&A
Alright.
box, please. Yes.
Okay.
All right. So once again, thank you very much for answering the 2 questions earlier. Yeah. Now I would like to introduce our upcoming events by the British Council, which is the New Direction East Asia 2021 conference on the 10th and 11th of December 2021, and joint conference of the 20th Asia TEFL International Conference, the 68th TEFL International Conference, and the 5th HINELTAL International Conference, which will be held on the 5th to the 7th of August 2022. Yeah, during the break, the videos will show the 2 upcoming events. Now let's take a 5-minute break. We will start the next session at 3:15. So see you again shortly. Thank you, Pak Subhan. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie.
good afternoon. I'm Mariam Kartika Trusni, and I'll be your host for today for the second part of the symposium. So welcome to part 2 of the 4th National Symposium on English Language Assessment, Stronger, More Relevant, More Connected, the Future of English Language Assessment in Indonesia. Again, my name is Mariam. I'm representing TEFLN today, part of the board of TEFLN. So in this part 2, we will have 3 speakers who will discuss stronger links for a future-ready workforce, how assessment builds skill sets for future employability. So tests provide opportunities for people to demonstrate their skills and language proficiency, opening doors to employment and career paths. In this discussion, the speakers will consider the importance of ensuring that tests assess the skills needed in the future workforce to build a stronger society. So there will be Bapak Beni Bandana Jaya from Director General of Vocational Education, Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. And we'll also have Ms. Mary Kent from the International Labour Organization and Ms. Latasha Safira, Center of Indonesia Policy Studies. Before we start, allow me to share with you some of the house rules. British Council will record the whole webinar session. By attending the session, you acknowledge that your image and comments may be recorded and rebroadcasted. Please type your question in the chat box on the YouTube by mentioning your name, organization, and city. Moderator will summarize and deliver the questions to the speakers. After the session ends, you'll be given a link to complete an evaluation survey. Link to download e-certificate and materials will be provided after you submit your feedback. Our Zoom webinar can accommodate up to 1,000 attendees. So for those who cannot join the webinar because the quota is full, please join via the British Council YouTube, which the committee will write the link in the chat box. And you can please share the link with your colleagues who cannot join via Zoom at the moment. So let us now, as we continue, let us now call on our first speaker, Bapak Beni Bandana Jaya, the Director General of Vocational Education, Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. Bapak Beni earned his bachelor's and master's degree from Institute Technology Bandung in Mechanical Engineering in 2002 and 2004, respectively. He earned a doctoral degree from the same university in Material Science and Engineering in 2009. He started his career as an instructor in 1995 at Manufacturing Polytechnical School in Bandung and was there up to 2020, where he was at the time the Deputy Director for Academic Affairs before he left and was appointed as the Director of Vocational and Professional Higher Education, Directorate General of Vocational Education. So without further delay, let us welcome Bapak Beni Bandana Jaya. Bapak Beni, please. Okay. Well, as we wait further, later on, after Bapak Beni, we will have also, okay, just let's us hold on. We have some, need to wait a little bit for some Bapak Beni. Right. While we wait for Bapak Beni, let us start now with Miss Mary Kent. Mary Kent is our next speaker, which is Mary leads. She leads the International Labor, she comes from the International Labor Organization Skills for Prosperity Program and Indonesia, which is funded by the UK government. So the program, which she is leading, it aims to improve the equity, quality, and relevance of maritime higher education and TVET in Indonesia with a targeted focus on promoting skills for employment for young women and men, including disadvantaged groups. Before joining the ILO, Mary was vice principal of the UK's Cardiff and Vale College Group. In her early career, she spent 12 years with Global Recruitment PLC, through which she worked extensively with private sector employers to identify and respond to current and future skills gap. Mary holds qualification in marketing, project management, business, international relations, and political economy, and currently is a member of advisory committee for the British Council in Wales. So without further ado, let's us welcome Ms. Mary Kent, please. The forum is yours.
Terima kasih, Ibu Mariam. Thank you very much. Please allow me to share my screen, if I may. Can participants see my screen? I will take that as a yes. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Selamat sore. In this presentation, I will introduce the Skills for Prosperity programme and will address the topic of preparing a future-ready workforce by taking you on a journey that today's graduates can expect ahead of them. As Ibu Mariam has just said, the Skills for Prosperity programme is funded by the UK government and delivered by the ILO, and aims to improve skills development policies and systems to respond to the growing maritime sector, taking targeted action on promoting skills for employment and decent jobs for young women and men, including disadvantaged groups. The programme is delivered through 4 Indonesian polytechnic partners, each specialising in a different part of the maritime economy. Why was the maritime economy chosen? Well, because this is one of Indonesia's assets with the largest potential for economic growth and increased prosperity. 70% of the population live and work in coastal areas, but this sector is heavily constrained by a lack of skills. So how are these skills constraints experienced by the maritime industry? To find this out, the programme ran several workshops in different regions, and here is how employers responded. At the bottom of the table, employers said they have challenges with unsynchronized government regulations, a lack of understanding about career opportunities in the maritime sector, and a shortage of suitable vocational training facilities. Higher up the list were concerns that the curricula didn't sufficiently reflect industry and a lack of graduates holding internationally recognised certification. But the most commonly cited and highest priority challenge in our consultations was the limitations of graduates' English language skills. So we asked these employers to share some examples of the types of English language interactions needed for the workplace. And here we see the comments that Dr. Zain made earlier, that the classroom and the workplace or real life can be very different. So aside from technical terminology, here are some examples that give us an insight of what graduates need to be prepared for. So listening and contributing in business meetings, resolving complaints from an angry customer, liaising with international port authorities, negotiating prices and terms of business, and ensuring a safety briefing is understood by customers whose first language may not be English. These are non-routine workplace interactions. So we compared this feedback with our students in our partner polytechnics, and we used the English Score app from British Council, which is very easy to use, to find out and get a basic measurement, a basic assessment of these students. Here are the results for our 4 polytechnic partners. And you can see that most of the students are rated A2 level, so they can understand frequently used expressions and can communicate in routine matters. And then the second largest category was for B1 level. So users who can understand standard input on familiar matters regularly encountered in work and can produce simple connected text on familiar topics. So you can see that in general, this is consistent with industry comments that graduates may not have the English language skills and confidence to respond to non-routine situations in the workplace. Now, for these learners, we need to appreciate that they are still in education and still learning. So this is not the end of their story, but it does give us a very useful baseline measurement of their ability to communicate in the workplace and the level of improvement needed to meet employer expectations. So I'm going to step away from the maritime sector for a moment and talk more generally about the journey that lies ahead of Indonesian students when they graduate. In Indonesia, the school to work or education to employment transition is comparatively weak. Graduate unemployment tends to be high, and particularly this is true for girls and young women, which of course has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Despite that, students have very high expectations. An Ipsos survey in 2017 shows that nearly 80% of youth in middle-income countries feel that they will have the opportunity to succeed in their preferred careers, and nearly 90% feel that they will be more likely to achieve their career goals than was the case for their parents. It takes time for Indonesian students to find work, and particularly to find stable employment. An average figure is 8 months to first employment and 15 months to the first stable or productive decent work employment. And finally, most graduates will expect to find work through informal networks, mainly family and friends. Almost half young people will find their first job in this way. This can be effective, but does have its limitations and is not a particularly effective mechanism for employers to find workers with specific skills. So that's a bit about the transition to the workplace, but what will work be like for today's graduates? Well, the future of work in Indonesia is changing and has been through structural changes from agriculture to manufacturing, and now with a reliance moving toward the service sector. A lot of the nation's growth to date has been through low-skilled employment, but with a huge national focus on human capacity development, this is likely to change. Indonesia's Critical Occupations List 2018 tells us that 1/3 of Indonesia's most critical occupations are at professional level, and 1/4 of these occupations are management roles. Indonesia has a growing age workforce population, so experts forecast that healthcare, construction, manufacturing, and tourism will be sectors that benefit from increased labour demand. Digitization and automation will transform the workplace globally. McKinsey's excellent 2019 report on automation in Indonesia forecasts that 23 million Indonesian jobs could be displaced by automation by 2030. In this time period, as many as 46 million jobs may be created, and of these, 10 million of these jobs will be entirely new occupations. And finally, we expect the pandemic to leave a legacy on the way we work, with a greater acceptance of remote working. And this has a huge impact for the types of career that graduates may have, provided they have the digital and communication skills required. So what does this mean for today's educators? Well, in summary, the type of work that graduates can expect will be very different. Some of the occupations that they will have do not even exist yet. In general, we can expect growth in the service sector and more global integration. Jobs are likely to be technology enabled, requiring higher levels of skills, more communication, and less routine tasks. Ways of working will be different. We expect to see remote working continuing, so graduates will need excellent communication skills and will need to be ready to work with others and add value in an online setting. The process of finding work will evolve. Today's graduates can expect to have multiple jobs in their working lives, and will be less constrained by mobility. This means that skills assessment and certification will be increasingly important as employers and recruiters will use assessment and certified skills as a recruitment sifting criteria. And finally, lifelong learning. As global forces and technologies evolve, working people will need to reskill and upskill to progress their careers. In this case, assessment and certification are vital not only to the process of entering the workforce, but in this context, they're also essential to re-entering the world of education and training later in life. So I trust this gives some useful insight about what the world of work has in store for today's graduates and the role of English and assessment within this. And I look forward to questions shortly. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mary Kent, for that insightful presentation about future work and the role of certification and how that could help with the future. So we will go on to the questions later on at the end of the session. So now we will call in our speaker, Mr. Bapak Beni Bandanajaya, who is here. So I would just go directly to him, Bapak Beni, and please, the forum is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Mariam. Let me prepare my presentation. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my presentation. Today, I would like to share some programs and policy at Vocational Education Directorate as how to prepare the Indonesian youth for future employability. Globalization has made the boundaries between countries seems to be disappears. This will certainly trigger global competition. Yeah, as we know that in Indonesia, the Directorate of Vocational Education of the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology is one key vehicle to prepare its youth population for this global competition. With this global perspective, vocational education, in particular vocational higher education, identify 2 key skills which is necessary for the Indonesian youth. This is international communication, of course, because we have to communicate with others country, and we have to prepare the 21st century skills. You know that the 21st century skills is going to need a soft skill of the graduates, such as including digital, collaborative, and creative thinking skills. There is some strategies which has delivered by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. We design to equip the vocational higher education student with these skills. These strategies are linked with the, the MBKM programs, Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka. Yeah, we call it Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka or Learning Autonomy or Campus Freedom Program. Yeah, which has recently launched by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. Yeah, as you know that the MBKM programs aim to produce competitive university graduates to ready for global workplace, which is also one of the national priorities. The strategies are creating a learning process that provide activities that match the passions and talents, that needed by the students. Yeah, and also we have to encourage the collaboration with all relevant stakeholders, in particular the industries. And the second one is that we manage the program that mainly makes the curriculum meet industrial demands. These programs are called Link and Match program. we name it as 8+I program. These programs consist of 8 activities that encourage link and match the higher education with the industry, including the development of curriculum with industry, project-based learning, internship program, inviting lectures from industry, certification of competence, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, some of those strategies, such as internships, teaching factory programs, are expected to be a medium to match the institution's curriculum with the industrial needs. The others programs such as certified short course programs is also implemented, and it is aimed to equip the student with the 21st century skills such as digital literacy, critical and creative thinking. And in this program, we managed to recommend key course for the student to take the MBKM programs. At this moment, we are also preparing international student mobility programs for the MBKM programs, meaning that the vocational higher education student can have chance to take internship and short course in our partners overseas. So at the consequence, the vocational higher education has an urgency to prepare its graduates for English proficiency systematically. As we are aware that English is currently used as the communication tools in many global contexts. This urgency will be arranged under the international programs of vocational higher education. We have built some consortium of vocational higher education, and we have this program will help our higher education to build the English proficiency of student, and we can help them to have the better score in English proficiency and can communicate with another student abroad. As I think that's all that I can share. A very short presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yes, thank you very much, Bapak Beni Bandanajaya. Thank you very much for sharing the programs of what you're planning for to help with the skills gap, and also some of the practical and problem, focused issues programs that you set up, such as the internship and the international mobility programs.
Yes. Yes.
So I think later on we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So before we go on to the Q&A, we would like to let our next speaker come in. And so thank you again, Bapak Beni Bandanajaya, for that sharing. The third speaker that we have today is Ms. Latasha Safira. She is the Head of Education Research at Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, CIPS, a think tank that promotes policy reforms through evidence-based and data-driven recommendations. She has a BA in Psychology from University of California, Berkeley, and completed her master's in International Social Public Policy at the London School of Economics last year. Her research focuses on how private sector initiatives can address gaps in the education sector in order to increase choice as well as accessibility to quality education at all income levels. So let us welcome Ms. Latasha. So the forum is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Maria. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Latasha, and I'm a researcher at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, or sometimes we're known as CHIPS. I'm very happy here today. And next slide. So before I explore the employability landscape in Indonesia, I would like to talk a little bit about CHIPS. We are an independent nonprofit think tank focusing on policy research and advocacy in 3 areas: food, trade, and agriculture, community livelihoods, and the digital economy, and education. And from all of our research, we aim to provide practical recommendations that would advance and reform policies to create a free and prosperous Indonesia. We are also particularly interested in the role of the private sector to address the gaps within the 3 pillars. And we don't just stop at the publication of these papers. We actually disseminate our findings in advocacy meetings with government stakeholders, private sector players, and civil societies as well. Next slide. Within the education wing, we have published several papers this year looking into low-cost private schools, pesantren, and even digital literacy. And this year, we have actually done a project with the British Council on attitudes of English in the SMK context. We launched a survey and conducted focus group discussions with employers, teachers, and students to really understand the experiences and expectations of English in relation to student employability. And today, I will be sharing some of our findings, and hopefully, I would like to hear back from you, from everyone here at the discussion as well, regarding our findings. So next slide. Next slide. So as Mary said, Indonesia is undergoing massive transformations in the job market, and there is a boom in the digitalization of businesses and operations. We are entering Industry 4.0 and possibly even 5.0. And while there have been concerns over the loss of jobs as a result of automation, it has actually been predicted that the creation of new technology will lead to the creation of new job opportunities. Next slide. Unfortunately, unemployment remains high. Currently, it's reported that about 6 to 7% of the population is unemployed, and we can assume that the numbers are actually higher than that due to the lack of data. Right now, youth unemployment is the highest it's ever been, and this has been attributed a lot to the talent shortage. A report from the World Bank found that the Indonesian workforce is not equipped with the skills needed to carry out even middle-class and middle-skilled jobs. And as Mary mentioned before, right now we are transitioning from low-skilled jobs to high-skilled jobs. This signals that there may be a large pool of the population, particularly among the youth, who are deemed unemployable. One thing to note, however, something that I do want to stress out is that employability and employment are not necessarily the same. So employability goes beyond securing a job. It also refers to the qualities needed to maintain an individual's employment and progress and improve in the workplace. Next slide. In addition to the unemployment rate, we also have to consider that in about 10 years, Indonesia is predicted to enter the phase of demographic bonus. So a demographic bonus refers to when the number of the productive population age in a country, which is 15 to 64 years, surpasses the number of the non-productive population age, which is below 15 years and above 64. So this really signals the urgency to prepare the youth and address employability now. We need to equip them with the necessary skills in order to maximize productivity in the labor force and ultimately maximize economic growth. And if we don't take advantage of the demographic bonus, this will not only limit economic growth, but it will also become very difficult for a huge portion of the population to escape or get out of middle income trap. Ultimately, the majority of the population may reach the retirement age with little to no savings, and they must depend on family members and maybe even public assistance in order to survive. Next slide. So what does testing for employability entail? And for the remainder of the presentation, I will be referencing some of our findings from our project with the British Council. Next slide. Firstly, we cannot talk about testing without touching on the limitations of our current curriculum. Why? Because what we are testing for will ultimately affect what is included in the curriculum and vice versa. What is included in the curriculum is what we are testing for. There is still a gap between the knowledge and skills that are being taught in schools and those required by employers and the industry. And as Mary also mentioned, the rate of graduation in Indonesia is almost at 100%. Yet graduates are finding it very difficult to secure employment because largely it has to do with the current curriculum being too theory-based and maybe even heavy on memorization. So students don't really have the opportunity to apply their knowledge, and ultimately they are unprepared to enter the job market upon graduation, even at entry level. One piece of data that we gathered was that teachers at the SMK level are also aware of the limitations of the curriculum, and they believe that it is too general to prepare students for the job market. They believe that the study of English at the SMK level especially should be more specialized and correspond with the specific needs and requirements of the industry. So for example, certain majors such as automotive engineering, agribusiness, technology, and tourism, these majors require specific vocabularies that may not be applicable in other majors, and it is not reflected in the current curriculum. Next slide. Next slide. Is it working? Okay. So I want to take a step back before I really dive into work-specific skills, digital skills, and its relation to English and employability, and just talk about the development of skills among the youth. So UNICEF noted 4 skills that are needed among adolescents to be successful in their work, their school, and in life. So foundational skills refer to the numeracy and literacy skills that will allow students to develop transferable skills. Foundational skills serve as the basis to support the development of other skills, operations, and tasks. And these skills can be applied or even transferred at some level across a variety of occupations and situations. And while foundational skills may serve as a basis, transferable skills can be seen as the glue that connects all 3 competencies in this framework. Digital skills refers to engagements with technology, and work-specific skills are skills that are that may be specifically required in a specific job or in a specific industry. And this week we are discussing English language assessments, or today we are discussing English language assessments. And if we're thinking about languages, and especially English being a second language to the majority of Indonesians, we really need to ensure that the relationship between foundational skills and transferable skills are strong enough so that students can further develop and apply their knowledge in the digital world and in their employment. And why this relates to curriculum is because in our study with the British Council, teachers have actually talked about one particular challenge of teaching English at the SMK level, which is that students who arrive in their first year may not have even mastered basic English proficiencies. And what this means is that this delays the development of English proficiencies and impacts the way, impacts the outcome, impacts the way they perform on assessments, and therefore may even affect the way they look for jobs or secure employment. Next slide. And Pak Benny talked about a little bit about soft skills, which I would like to think about, which I would like to talk about a little bit here. We also need to think long-term about what kinds of skills we are equipping students before they enter the workforce. Although job-specific skills are necessary, we also have to remember that industries are ever-changing so rapidly. So oftentimes by the time students graduate, the curriculum, or at least a part of the curriculum, can become obsolete. And in addition, we also have to consider that not everyone stays in one industry for their entire lives. A report by McKinsey found that due to automation, at least 50% of Indonesians will experience reskilling and upskilling by 2050. And reskilling refers to the provision of new skills to enable employees to perform a different job within the company, while upskilling refers to the upgrade in capabilities to enable employees to keep up with the rapid changing economy. And what this means is that employability or competencies required for employability is not always confined to industry-specific knowledge. So we really need to hone in on these foundational skills so that students and employees will be better able to develop other necessary competencies, reskill, upskill, and therefore maintain their employability. I just wanted to mention a BCG report found that Indonesian employers have actually ranked skills, analytical skills, communication, creativity, adaptability, and innovation as the competencies that will be important for future jobs. Next slide. So now start presenting more about our findings from our study with the British Council. And unsurprisingly, employers have identified English as one of the most needed and important skill for future employment. Although to varying levels, the use of English is present in state-owned, multinational, foreign, and private companies. And it's also present in the public sector as well, especially for employees who need to interact or partner with foreign investors or foreign partners. And why is this happening really is globalization. A lot of local companies have planned to expand and open branches, factories, and franchises in South Asia and Southeast Asia over the next 5 to 10 years. And this kind of hints to the extent to which English could become a hiring requirement or even a prospect for promotion. An example could be SMK graduates who majored in tourism. They must be able to ask and answer questions in English to pass the interview process for on-the-job training. And this was an anecdote that we found from interviews with employers. And I also wanted to highlight that among the 4 language skills, which is speaking, writing, reading, and listening, in countries where English is not the official language, reading skills were rated as the most important, followed by speaking skills, which I will elaborate on later when we talk about migrant workers. Next slide. So teachers have very similar perceptions of the extent to which English is important for employability. And when asked why they think English is important, overwhelmingly they talk about industry demand. And all of these reasons are actually related to each other. So it's an industry demand because it will facilitate job performance, especially when they have to interact with foreigners, and this will improve their communication skills, and ultimately increase their competitiveness. So all of this, all of the reasons that teachers have included as to why English is important is quite similar and echoed in employers as well. Next slide. So in the case of migrant workers is, it's not always the track that everyone ends on, but there is a segment of the population who do leave Indonesia, and they actually need to be equipped with at least basic English competencies, because it could be required to integrate and assimilate in the country's job market once they are placed abroad. So for example, Malaysia labor migration MOUs with Indonesia specify that migrant workers must be able to communicate in English or Bahasa Melayu. And as I've said before, a lot of countries where English is not their official language have stated that English reading skills are the most important to develop. And this has a lot to do with protection as well. So in Hong Kong, a study by Ladegard found that Indonesian migrant workers tend to be significantly underpaid because their employment contracts tend to be written in English or Chinese. So it's this language barrier that can that render a lot of Indonesian migrant workers vulnerable to exploitations. Thankfully, we do have some regulations to protect Indonesian migrant workers because employment contracts are required to be written in both Bahasa Indonesia and English, but this doesn't protect migrant workers once they have been deployed or once they have settled in the country that they are, the foreign country that they will be traveling to or working at. So equipping future migrant workers is very important to safeguard them from abuse, mistranslations, and ostracization. And kind of segueing into the importance of everyday life, Indonesian migrant workers have actually reported more feelings of isolations and marginalizations due to their limited English competencies compared to Filipino migrant workers. So this shows that English might have been viewed as a value added at first or potentially a requirement in certain industries, but now it might even be more important. The value of English might be even greater because it has to do with how you communicate in your everyday life. And this is actually understood by a lot of teachers as well. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the howevers. First of all, we found that the domicile in which students are situated plays a huge role in the attitudes of English among SMK teachers. So really, the extent to which English is important for employability also depends on the local demands. So when we go back to the graph or the data on to what extent or how teachers rated the importance of English competencies for employability, we did dissect and look at the portion of the teachers who viewed English as actually not being so important for employability. And for example, SMK teachers for automotive engineering, particularly those in rural areas, they don't find English as important for their students' career prospects. So an example would be a teacher in Bekasi noted that the majority of automotive factories in the area are actually Japanese owned. So the instruction manual may be produced in English, but it's actually Japanese skills or competencies that are required, if not more valued, for SMK graduates to develop and master in order to actually use the equipment. And this isn't necessarily specific to rural versus urban areas. For example, a teacher from Samarinda who teaches tourism notes that because international guests very rarely visit the area, SMK graduates don't really need to develop a professional proficiency level in English in order to perform their jobs well. Next slide.
Mrs. Tasha, sorry to interrupt. We're going to need to go to the Q&A very soon. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So I guess we can, okay. So let me just try to go through this really quickly. So there is a quite significant difference between the perception of teachers and students as to how easy or difficult it is for students to master the 4 English competencies. And this is kind of where we have to be careful about, because it seems that a lot of students believe that they have better English competencies compared to what their teachers observe or even employers. And this may have to do with the national examination, testing mostly very basic English competencies. The next slide. Next slide. Okay. And unfortunately, strangely enough, but not so surprisingly, this is not really necessarily reflected in the actual scores that they achieve. So as we can see, a report from a World Bank found that a lot of students actually don't really score well in the national exams for English. And this is just even basic English competencies. So we haven't even gone into English that is more job specific or English with a specific purpose. No, we can go to the next slide. Next slide. So how can we improve employability? So since we're running out of time, something that I do want to kind of highlight or end this, how I want to end this presentation is with an anecdote, and it has to do with going beyond traditional forms of assessment. So during our focus group discussions, some of the teachers talked about how how important it is to have debate competitions, because it actually gives them a better understanding of how far and how much students are developing their English competencies. So during debate competitions, students have the opportunity to think critically, practice negotiation, practice communication in English. And this is really this gives them the opportunity to really apply their knowledge in a real world circumstance, and gives them a better understanding of how English is used in the job market. So I'll end the presentation here so we can start having some, we can start the Q&A session. I'm so sorry if I went over time, but thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Latasha. That was very insightful. It echoed what they discussed about the massive transformations in the landscape of employability and employment, and also talent shortages, and also the point on employment versus employability. I think there's very, very interesting things that you have shared and shed a light so now we would like to ask all the speakers to please turn on your cameras. Yes, Latasha, I can see you, Ms. Mary Kent and Bapak Benny Bandanyajaya. So we're now going to the first question that we have for Ms. Mary. There is somebody who asked this question for you. Do you think that the English curriculum in Indonesia has been in line with the international industry needs?
Thank you for that question. That's a very big question. And I think we've seen from the presentations today that demand for English is perhaps greater than the system is providing at the moment. However, this is not only a situation that needs to be responded to by the education authorities and by government. Part of the role of educators is to prepare students for the work and life that lies ahead of them. And some of that may be about raising their aspirations. I think as Latasha said, students and sometimes teachers have higher views on students' capabilities, and perhaps by really raising their aspirations and allowing them to try their language in realistic working environments, perhaps through link and match activities with employers, that would give those students an idea and help raise their aspirations to improve their languages. And again, as Latasha said, industry is not one homogenous group of people. There are vast different demands, and Japanese language and other languages are very important, and lots of other skills are important. So it would be wrong to focus only on English language. It's important, but there are many things that are important in education. Ibu Mariam.
Yes, I am on mute, so that always happens. So thank you. Regardless how many times we do this, always happens. So yes, thank you, Ms. Mary, from that answer. I hope that answers the question. But as you mentioned, it's something that people need to look at and see how that can help with the work and industry situation, which is so diverse. So we cannot just say that the curriculum itself will help with employability, but how that is used depending on the context of where they're going to work. I think that's what a summary of what you were saying. All right. Well, thank you. We're going to go on to the next question. We're just going to do one question each for each speaker. So this next question is for Pak Beni Bandajaya. This is from Ibu Tuti. She said, my question for Pak Beni: what strategies should be done by the teachers for preparing the students to overcome the challenge in proficiency English after they graduated their studies, as we know that English hours is only 2 hours, around 90 minutes a week as scheduled. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there is some strategies that we can do with the student, as we can build English speaking activities outside classroom, such as participating in various language competition maybe, and of course including international student mobility activities. So we have a program of student mobility, so the student can maybe join this program and they can encourage the English proficiency of themselves. Or we can create an English community among students, and they can practice outside the classroom, and they can train their English and in the form of course, extracurricular activities. Because the most effective learning is how to practice it, how to learn from the real condition with another partners, or maybe in a real situation. Yeah, I think that's all my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Beni. I think that's so 90 hours on top of that, do other things, right, Pak? Yeah, to simulate what the real life or what they can encounter in the industry later on. All right. Yes. Thank you, Pak Beni. I hope that answers your question, Ibu Tuti. And we'll move on to the next question. Ms. Latasha, the question is, as we know in Indonesian context, the unemployment rate for vocational school and diploma is the highest based on the BPS survey. The government tries to solve the issue, which is likely by giving more funding to schools with greater achievement while the problem may come mostly from low-cost private schools or academy. From here, we might conclude that there is a mismatch between the roots of the problem and the allocation of funding done by the government. Is it also something you have found in your or your colleagues' studies, in your studies? Thank you, Ms. Maya Puspitasari. Thank you for that question, Maya.
That's a very good question. The scope of our project didn't actually go into funding. However, I guess there's two parts to this question. Two parts to this answer. So first of all, the problem with granting more funding to to schools that are achieving higher scores is that the scores that they are achieving itself is not necessarily indicative of the development of English competencies. Again, like I said, the national exam really just covers basic English competencies, and it's kind of an artificial setting, if I'm being honest, to just use those scores as an indication of how well a school is doing in terms of equipping their students with the necessary English competencies. However, funding could be useful because in our focus group discussions, we did talk about how exactly what Pak Benny said, there's 90 minutes to study, but some teachers actually provide after school options for students who really want to develop their English skills. Unfortunately, some of these after school programs are quite limited because they need more funding. So funding could be it's a potential solution. It just needs to be directed better, or there needs to be a more meaningful or purposeful way to really target how we can improve English competencies or improve the opportunities for students to develop those English competencies through funding. But apart from that, the root of the problem, as you ask, it might not be in funding. It might be the fact that when we're talking about employability, some teachers themselves don't really have a great understanding of the industries in which they're preparing their students for. So possibly providing a seat at the table for private sector players who really have a say about how their industries are developing. What do teachers need to know, and then teach their students about the industry that they're about to enter. So hopefully that answers your question. We could talk forever about English and employability and vocational schools in Indonesia, but I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Latasha, and to all the speakers, thank you very much for your sharing today to the participants. And so we will now move on to the next section. But thank you once again. So now before we move on to the next section, I will be sharing some information to the participants that the e-certificate and the evaluation survey information will be at the end of the session today at part 3. So just tune in for that part. And also after this, we'll have a short break while they play the video of the upcoming events, the British Council's New Directions East Asia 2021 conference on 10 and 11th of December, and the joint conference of the 20th Asia TEFL International Conference, the 68th TEFL International Conference, and the 5th INELTA International Conference on 5th, 6th, and 7th of August, 2022. And we will be right back to part 3 at approximately a 5 minutes break after this. So thank you once again to all the speakers and all those who participated in part 2. We'll see you in the next part of this National Symposium. Goodbye.
Good morning, everybody, from a surprisingly sunny but rather cold London. And selamat sore semua di Indonesia. Selamat datang to the final part of today's symposium, where we welcome our distinguished panel to discuss how English language connects the international community, focusing specifically on English as a medium of education. My name is Steve Copeland. I'm a senior consultant for research and insight in the English for Education systems team at the British Council. I have a strong interest in assessment. I was previously the British Council's head of examiner standards for IELTS. And prior to that, I spent 20 years as a teacher, examiner, teacher trainer, and academic director in Southeast Asia, South America, North Africa, and in the UK. And my first teaching job in 1993, which I can just about remember, was in Jakarta. So I'm really delighted to be back in Indonesia today, if only virtually. And before we begin, I'll give you a quick reminder of the house rules. Okay, so the British Council will record the whole webinar session. So by attending, you acknowledge that any comments or images may be recorded and rebroadcast. Please type any questions you have in the Q&A on Zoom or the chat box on YouTube, and mention your name, organization, and city. And I'll summarize and ask questions to the speakers after the presentations. I suggest you wait till nearer the end of each presentation to put your questions, just in case the question is answered in the presentation. After the session ends, you'll be given a link to complete an evaluation survey, and the link to download your e-certificate and materials will be provided after you submit your feedback. So please don't all send us questions saying, how do I get my certificate? After you've submitted the feedback, and we'll send you the link, then you get the certificate and the materials. Now we have a limit of 1,000 people on Zoom. I'm not sure how many we currently have, but we're putting the link to the British Council YouTube page in the chat. So please do send this to anyone you know who can't get onto Zoom. So to our panel topic today, we know that language enables the exchange of ideas, understanding, and culture between nations and societies. And English, as an international language, is often seen as a means to connect. Like many countries, Indonesia has seen a growth in English as a medium of education, EME, also known as English as a medium of instruction, EMI. And this session will examine the role of EME, English, and languages in bringing people together. So to do that, let me introduce our first speaker. Anne Veach is the British Council's global lead for English medium education and multilingual education, and she's responsible for our global program, English in a Multilingual World. Morning, Anne. Based in Scotland, Anne has worked in English language teaching, teacher training, and academic and program management for over 20 years. And she's the author of the British Council's Perspective on English in Higher Education, English Medium paper, which she'll be telling us about today. So, Anne, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Scotland. I'm going to start my session with a short quiz for you. I'd like you to use the chat box and type your answer, A, B, or C. So how many of the world's international students are learning through English? Is it about a quarter, about a half, or about 3/4? Lots of answers coming through. It's B, about a half, about 50%. This is based on a 2006 study published by the British Council. The growth in English medium and higher education has been fast and substantial. One academic, Ernesto Macaro, likens it to an unstoppable train. If it is an unstoppable train, it's a Japanese bullet train which has left the station and is travelling at pace. My second question for you. In Indonesia, how many institutes of higher education offer courses through English as a language of learning and teaching? Is it A, none, B, A, all, B, none, or C, we don't know? Excellent, you're all saying C, which is correct. We don't know, but what we do know is that the number is growing organically, especially among so-called elite universities. And I'm sure my fellow presenters today will elaborate on this in their talks. My final question for you: what percentage of academic publications are published in English? Is it A, 50%, B, 75%, or C, 90%? A wide variety of answers here. It's C, 90%. This is according to a 2013 study. Over the past century, the number of publications in English has grown from 35% at the turn of the 20th century to over 90% at the end of the century. English dominates as a language of academic publication, and given this, it's arguably a necessity in higher education as it's needed to access publications and cutting-edge knowledge. English also dominates in other spheres too. It's labelled as the language of international business, the language of science, and the language of technology. The facts are that English plays a central role in much of higher education, particularly internationalised higher education. And English medium education is often seen as a means to achieve internationalisation, increase international competitiveness and profile, increase income of universities, increase international rankings and quality, and improve levels of English. English can be both a force for good and a force for ill. As a common shared language, it can enable exchange and collaboration of ideas and people globally, which are essential elements of internationalisation. And although language is never neutral, English is often labelled as a neutral language, particularly in multi-ethnic and multilingual societies where its use as a language of learning and teaching avoids conflict. English can create opportunities for individuals, enhancing employability and social mobility. And institutions, enhancing their economic standing and educational standing. In terms of student learning outcomes, English medium education can help develop English language skills alongside content and subject knowledge. English in higher education can also be seen as the bad guy. It's personified as a killer language, a monstrous multi-headed hydra, an imperialist post-colonial tool of oppression, which creates a lack of diversity in language, a standardization of cultures, and causes linguicide and epistemicide. English can widen social divides, acting as a gatekeeper to opportunity. It's generally the rich and advantaged who are able to access these opportunities. English as a medium of education can inhibit the transfer of knowledge from academic or lecturer to student, either because students or lecturers lack English ability or lecturers lack pedagogical and other skills to teach in an English medium multilingual environment. Given the prevalence of English in higher education, the controversies around it, and British Council's role globally, we decided about 2 years ago that we needed to have a global position or a perspective on English medium in higher education to guide our approach, have a cohesive message, and dispel some of the assumptions about what British Council believes and our approach to English. As the British Council, we're a UK headquartered organisation, and we may be seen as promoters of the spread of English medium, promoting the Englishisation of education, endorsing a British English version of English as the more correct and superior model. But I hope by the end of my presentation, you'll understand that we would like to do none of these things. So before looking at British Council's perspective in more detail, I'd like to briefly focus on terminology and how we label the use of English as a language of learning and teaching. This session is looking at English as a medium of education, or EME for short, and this is British Council's preferred term. I'll look at why we prefer this term in a moment, but a more commonly used way, and a way some of our panellists today will refer to it, is English as a medium of instruction, or EMI for short. So which to use? For me, it doesn't matter. We can call it EMI or EME. British Council prefers the term EME as it reflects many of the values and approaches we think should be part of English as a language of learning and teaching. English is short for EMIS, or English Medium Education in Multilingual University Settings, which is a term coined by two academics in the field, de Voets and Smit. We like the term EME because it's more inclusive. It situates English medium as a social phenomena and reflects the need for a more holistic approach to English medium at a systems, institutional and classroom level. It recognises that English medium is about both learning and teaching. It's interactional, it's not just about instruction. It situates what happens in the classroom within a wider institutional perspective. At British Council, we also situate EME in higher education within wider educational systems and acknowledge the interconnected and interlinked nature of higher education and basic education, recognising the far-reaching impacts English medium has beyond the classroom, including on all aspects of the curriculum, including assessment. The term promotes the treatment of English as part of a multilingual educational environment. All higher education is multilingual. It promotes a view of internationalisation achieved through languages, not just English, and mutual exchange. It positions multilingualism as a resource rather than a problem to be fixed. At British Council, our approach to English medium reflects the fact that English is not homogenous. There exists a huge variety of Englishes, and these global Englishes should be of equal value and status as so-called native speaker English and the norms and models associated with it. So in terms of our perspective, the elements of English medium education and what it means are reflected in our position on English medium. We advocate for a holistic approach to EME, recognising that EME impacts on the whole education system, institution, curriculum. We advocate for a greater importance of language of learning and teaching and quality and equitable education, and EME policies and practice, which encourage the development with a valid, fit for purpose, achievable, responsible language of education policies built through bottom-up and top-down consultation. At a classroom level, at a systems level, at a classrooms level, for content lecturers using English as a language of learning and teaching, we advocate for needs-based support systems focused on developing not only English proficiency, but also pedagogical and intercultural and communication skills, which are vital for successful learning outcomes. We encourage greater collaboration between language and content specialists in EMA contexts, with English specialists working with content lecturers to ensure skills are shared and there's a cohesive approach to the curriculum. For students, we strongly advocate for a needs-based support system, which widens access to EMA programs and develops skills relevant not only for current study, but also future employment. So overall, our position as British Council is to promote quality and successful learning outcomes through EMA, through better decision and policy making and better practice. We don't endorse English as a medium of education, and we don't encourage the spread of EMA. We recognise that decisions about language of learning and teaching are complex, complicated, confusing and challenging, often driven by politics, economics and history. If my talk has sparked your interest, I'd encourage you to read our full perspective, which is very much just a starting point, and the link is here. I'll hand back to you now, Steve.
Brilliant, thanks, Anne. Excellent, and we're on time, even better. So for our next presentation, we have two speakers. Agata Mikołajewska is a doctoral researcher at the Centre for Applied Linguistics at University College London, Institute of Education. Her current research focus is on internationalisation and English medium instruction, and Agata is a co-author of the British Council report on global mapping of English as a medium of instruction in higher education 2020 and beyond. And Kari Sahan is an honorary research fellow in the Department of Education, University of Oxford. She's an assistant project lead for the Teaching English and Teaching in English network and a member of the EMI Oxford Research Group. She's also contributed to a number of British Council projects, including the Global Mapping of EMI report that both Agatha and Anne were also involved with, and an ELT Research Award funded paper on EMI in higher education in East Asia, which has just been published just last week and is available on the British Council Teaching English website. So, Agatha, I'm going to hand over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone, regardless of where you're joining from. Kara will be in charge of the slides today. So Kari and I are going to present the findings from a recently published report on global mapping of EME or EMI, whichever term you prefer, in 52 countries. Kari, can we go to this next slide? So our research group, the project is a joint venture of the British Council and the University of Oxford. Our research team was consisted of 8 members, and we sought to investigate the current situation of EMI in higher education in official development assistance countries, as these have been highlighted as context neglected in EMI research so far. So hence we wanted to fill this gap. We also wanted to have a scoping view of EMI and ask questions: what, how, to what extent, to create a snapshot of the current reality of EMI to enable better tracking of EMI development. So considering the scope of the project, it was very broad. We wanted to rely on multiple sources of data, just so if information was missing from one source, then we could supplement this information from another data source. So let me explain the study's methodology to better illustrate it. The study was carried out in 3 stages. In stage 1, we distributed an open-ended questionnaire to British Council's informed respondents. We aimed to receive 1 response per country. We had 42 returns, or 55 returns out of 52 responses the requests that we've sent out. Step 2 involved a content analysis of universities' websites information in regards to, for example, English language requirements for students as part of the admissions process, or for example, the extent of provision of EMI that is offered by this university. So whether the university offers EMI at undergrad, postgrad, or whatever levels. And lastly, in stage 3, we reached out to universities in the countries looked at and asked the institutional key players to answer some questions about EMI. So, and we asked questions, similar questions that were covered in stages 2 and 3, but we also extended the questionnaire by asking questions about the future of EMI. So what is the intended planning and policy? Does the university intend to expand EMI provision? And we received 227 responses. And because we have a wealth of data that we could talk about today, today's focus will be language assessment for students. So we'll only be focusing on admissions criteria, focusing on the English language requirement.
Thanks, Agatha. So I'll start us off by looking at these findings. As Agatha said, today we're going to focus on language assessment as an admission criteria. Specifically, what were the English language proficiency criteria? Or rather, were there any English language proficiency criteria for entry? And what we found was that English language proficiency was a common requirement, or it was fairly common at least. So in our stage 1 data, we found that 29 out of the 45 respondents indicated that there was some form of language assessment for students entering EMI programs in their country. These findings were replicated in both stage 2 and stage 3. In stage 2, you'll remember that was our website analysis. We found that nearly all websites, more than 90% of them, included some form of admission criteria on their website. So that would just generally be how students would enter the program. In terms of English language requirements, more than half of the websites indicated that there was an English language proficiency requirement for all students entering all English medium programs. In addition to this number, about 8% also had an English proficiency requirement in place for some of their English medium programs. We found very similar findings in stage 3. So this was our survey response. And as Agata said, we had 227 responses at this stage. So here our respondents indicated, about half of our respondents indicated that all undergraduate students entering an EME program had to indicate that they had a sufficient level of English proficiency. And then another 12% of respondents indicated that either some students or students on some programs had to demonstrate sufficient English proficiency. That might be international students, but not local students, for example. However, at both stage 2 and stage 3, these findings suggest that about a third of universities in our sample did not have an English language proficiency requirement in place for undergraduate students entering English medium programs. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what those requirements look like. We found across each stage of the study that the requirements were university specific and context specific. So what we mean by this is that rather than having either a level of English proficiency that was required across all universities in that country, universities typically chose for themselves what the English language proficiency requirement would be and how it would be assessed. We found that the most common form of language assessment for students enrolling to EME programs was through international exams, such as by submitting an IELTS or a TOEFL exam score. However, you can see here, we also found that there were many other ways in which students' language was assessed, such as through in-house exams or through an English component of some kind of an entrance exam. We also saw that secondary school scores were often used, specifically the English scores that students had leaving secondary schools. This was most common in sub-Saharan Africa, where we found secondary education tended to be conducted, at least in part, through English, especially compared to other regions. However, we also found that in some cases, the level of English that was required was quite vague. For example, students must have good English, or they had to demonstrate a certain level of English, but it was not necessarily clear how that level would be assessed. So as I said, the most common form of assessment was through international exam scores. I want to dive a bit deeper into that now by looking at exactly what scores were required. We found across universities a huge range. So while many universities did require an international exam score, such as IELTS or TOEFL, there was a huge range. So you can see here from stage 2, that ranged from an IELTS 4.5 to a 7. And I'll show you in just a minute what we found at stage 3, but it was a similarly broad range. To get an example of what this variation looked like, we found that one university in Indonesia, according to its website, said that postgraduate students needed to submit at least an IELTS 5, but another university in Lebanon said that postgraduate students needed to submit an IELTS 6.5. So you can see here that in different contexts and different universities, we had very different requirements. However, despite this range, we found that for undergraduates, admission criteria generally clustered around about a B1 or a B2 level of the Common European Framework of Reference. So this was generally what universities required, although there was a huge range. I'm sharing with you this table here. These are our findings from stage 3. So this is according to survey responses of what the minimum requirement was to enter the undergraduate EME programs according to various types of exams. And as you can see, there was a huge range here. I'm now going to pass off to Agata, who's going to talk a bit more about our findings at the postgraduate level.
Thank you, Carrie. So in general, the requirements for postgraduate students were slightly higher, tended to be slightly higher than for undergraduates. So as you can see, here we have an example here of Ramkhamhaeng University in Thailand. They required a minimum of 65 TOEFL score for undergraduates, while it was 75 for postgraduates. And there was also an instance of a university in Indonesia, Gadjah Mada University, that required postgraduate students to submit. They had some kind of requirement for postgraduate students, but they didn't for undergraduates. And generally, minimum English language requirement for postgraduate students was B2 or higher, while for undergrad it was B1, B2. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So the key takeaways from today's presentations are about half of universities that we looked at have some kind of language proficiency assessment, with the international English language tests being the most common one. But what we need to be looking into in the future is whether the threshold that the university set are appropriate for the context. So is it that after achieving B1 or B2 level, students do not experience language-related challenges, or are they at least minimized to kind of an optimal extent? And we need to look into the appropriateness of this type of assessment. So does it reflect students' language needs in EME? The international language, English language tests have been developed for a different purpose, and as talked about it, they might be not the best fit for the purpose. So that needs to be looked into. And to conclude, we definitely need more research to evaluate the assessment methods, and we need to look into language support that is needed, because this is something that has been highlighted in the study, that it's definitely needed, and that there is no kind of framework or good practice of how students should be supported during their studies. And one very important thing is we advocate for increased clarity of EMI provision. We had really a hard time trying to find information on EME in so many contexts, just looking by the university's websites, that we do advocate for including greater transparency of information on EMI on universities' websites. And maybe I will stop here and let's leave some time for Q&A.
And again, if what we've said today is interesting to you, this was a really quick 10-minute presentation. Do please check out the report. You can see the title and the cover page of it here. And do contact us if you have any questions. We'll hand it back to Steve now.
Thank you, Agatha and Carrie. It is indeed extremely difficult to present an entire piece of research in 10 minutes, and you did it in 11, so it's quite impressive. And I would strongly recommend that you do have a look at these reports. Colm's putting the links in the chat because there's an awful lot more very interesting content in there, not just about the assessment side, but the much broader picture. Now, for our final presentation, we welcome Dr. Nilawati Hadisantosa, who is a senior lecturer in TEFL at the English Department, Faculty of Education and Language at Majaya Catholic University of Indonesia. Her research interests include English bilingual education, motivation in language learning, teacher education, and sociolinguistics. And Ibu Nila contributed to the British Council's publication, Learning Through English, Policies, Challenges and Prospects, Insights from East Asia in 2010, and subsequently has presented papers on English bilingual education in seminars both inside and outside Indonesia. So Ibu Nila, welcome, and over to you. You're still on mute, Ibu Nila. Bingo.
Thank you, Pak Steve. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So this is the last session, and I'm going to give a summary report of our last research together with some researchers. Okay, so we work together, Pak Martin Lam from University of Leeds, and Pak Hari Kucha from Leeds, and also Pak Dana Waskita from ITB, yeah, and Pak Fauzan from Undip. So we have increased adoption of English as a medium of instruction in Indonesia, as mentioned before by the other writers, by the other researchers as well. But there are rising concerns despite having support from the government. So we are concerned to understand the extent of EMI and to find out whether it is being implemented in effective ways, and how it might be supported to optimize educational achievement. So as I mentioned, this report was commissioned by the British Council to address these issues. So the definition for EMI that we use is from Macaro, the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. EMI in the East Asia region. Despite concerns about educational benefits and social inclusivity, there was a general trend towards rapid expansions of EMI and an expectation that it would continue to grow. So in his research, Dirjen mentioned some countries, and we also quote some from China, Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, etc. The research methodology that we use in our research is online questionnaires for institutional managers, online questionnaire for lecturers engaged in EMI, and we sometimes ask people that we know to give the questionnaire to their lecturers. And we have 3 case studies with class observation, lecturer interviews, and student focus group. And we have other data as well. And the sampling, actually we have quite a number of sample here, 110. All right, and then, but we only got 24 responses from university managers, which are actually 22% of the samples. And it's from 19 institutions in Java. As we know that most of the universities that use EMI are the elite ones, so it's not surprising. And 3 institutions in Sumatra, 1 institution in Sulawesi, and another institution in Bali. And we have the results here. I'm not going to discuss this one by one because it will take a lot of time. But for the summary of findings, what is the current ambition for EMI in higher education institutions? And how is this supported through national policy, local policies, and implementation strategies? So EMI is a very recent development. There is no official policy, and the legal position is questionable. It's true that there is no official policy. We heard that, oh, there is one, but in fact, we cannot find any so far. And this is the fact. And then who and or what are the driving forces behind the implementation of EMI in higher education institutes in Indonesia? Well, it's not surprising that the driving force is actually the institutional profile ranking. So the institution would like to have a high academic reputation and the place for internationalization. And for that, by using EMI, we will get, hopefully, more academic papers in English language journals, and then academic staff exchange, and it's been happening, and then incoming international students. What are the strategies, approaches, and forms of EMI currently being implemented in higher education institutes in Indonesia? Well, EMI is not a uniform method, but a cover term for a very diverse range of practices. and what is working well and what is not working well. What are the key challenges and opportunities? Overall, we found a high level of enthusiasm for EMI. The respondents still exuded positivity about EMI, only if the conditions were right. If the teachers are supposed to teach a smaller class, in Indonesia, we sometimes have a big class as big as 60 students or 50 students. And then the important thing as well is good students' academic English competence, good quality specialist training for lecturers. And in our research, we found out that only some give training to the lecturers. What is working well and what is not working well? What are the key challenges and opportunities? Yeah. So the key challenges, of course, is the academic competence of the students. That's the biggest challenge. And also the teachers themselves, the lecturers. Sometimes they did not have enough information about the method used. For the opportunities, lots of managers, well, I think all of the managers agree that it is possible to continue the program of using EMI. And the implication or recommendation, the Ministry of Education gives consideration to the creation of a quasi-official body with responsibility for monitoring and advising on the implementation of EMI programs in higher education institutes. But we have to remember that EMI might represent a threat to student education as well as an opportunity. If the program is done badly, it can harm individuals' future careers and undermine confidence in higher education institution. Higher education institutions should be encouraged to publish their policy on medium of instruction, providing a clear rationale for use of English, stating the learning goals explicitly, and giving information about how those goals are assessed. The fact is, lecturers and students need explicit information about whether any particular course is designed to promote language skills as well as subject knowledge, and whether subject knowledge goals are equivalent to those on Indonesian medium courses, and how the objectives are assessed in a valid and reliable way. So far, we don't get enough information about this in terms that most of the universities that use EMI didn't give enough explanation for all of this. So students entering EMI program should have a minimum level of proficiency in English, as certified by reputable English language tests. In our case studies, we found out in some departments that the lecturers only use the paper-based TOEFL test, so around 450, which is definitely is not enough. If we compare it to Germany, for example, so they have the level of B2, so upper intermediate level of English. The ministry should support the development of an English language test for Indonesian high schools and higher education institutes, which can be aligned with international standards such as CEFR. So it was also mentioned by previous speakers. Higher education institutes which want to implement EMI need to rethink their English teaching strategy. So it is very common that a lot of lecturers still don't know how to teach in terms of using the student-centered approach. So there are still teachers, lecturers who use the so teacher-centered one. And we recommend close collaboration between the university language centers and faculties, with discipline-specific instruction offered to students who are engaged in EMI course. It would be a good idea if the universities also give free lesson for the students in the university language centers, for example, so that they can reach the level required for EMI.
Ibu Nila, sorry to interrupt, but we will have to wrap up quite quickly.
Okay.
We're nearly out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Steve. So we must recognize that EMI also requires investment in staff training, specifically in teaching methodology and in appropriate educational technology. And I think I can stop here. So we have to make sure that in Indonesia, where English is learned outside from institution as much as within them, there is an even greater risk of class exclusion because we have the lower level or the upper level of social class. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's a great ending there because we've actually gone back to the very beginning of the conference where Pak Subanzain was talking about some of those issues, and particularly that question of the idea of a localized test. Okay, we have time for just a few questions. I know we're nearly out of time. Hopefully everyone can hang around a little longer. So can I ask all the speakers to turn their cameras on, please? Great. And actually, I'm going to combine two questions together for Ibu Nila, first of all. Do you think that in future, more and more universities in Indonesia will adopt EMI on their non-English courses? And how ready are universities in Indonesia to do that? And specifically, what do you think that means for assessment?
Thank you, Pak Steve. From our research, we know that the managers of universities are really eager to have the EMI in the universities, but unfortunately, in terms of assessment, we still need help. So probably we need help also from the Ministry of Education as well, so that we can have about the same level of English here. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question from Maya for Kari. And I'm really pleased, Maya, you've asked this question because it was a question I was hoping somebody would ask. do you think an English standardized test such as TOEFL or IELTS measures what it's supposed to measure in an HE context? Is it fit for purpose? And of course, this actually, Pak Zain at the very beginning of this, this series was suggesting that TOEFL and IELTS are not appropriate for testing language teaching proficiency. So what's your view on this?
Thank you for that question. And yes, thank you, Maya. I think that this is the million-dollar question right now looking at EME. As Agata stated at the end of our presentation, we ourselves are raising issues as to whether or not this is the most effective way to measure language proficiency, or rather the language proficiency that is needed for teaching and learning through English. I mean, I think that these exams, they do a lot, and so there's a reason why universities are adopting these. The second part of your question, or the last part of your question, reflects that. If we don't use these exams, then what else can a university do? How can a university, gauge the English proficiency of a student coming from one context or a student coming from the other? However, we're increasingly seeing a growing body of research that's suggesting that a simple level of general English proficiency is not enough for students entering English medium courses. Rather, we're seeing the need for more support that relates specifically to academic English, so EAP courses, English for academic purposes, might be needed. We're also seeing that general academic English is also not enough when we get into really technical subjects, for example, advanced engineering in English, or perhaps advanced psychology in English. I think that we all here have a very high level of English, but if we're getting into the technicalities of, for example, mechanical engineering, we might not know that either in our first languages or in our second languages or in English, simply because these are very technical terms. So we're also seeing the need for specific discipline-specific English as well. And that might be through English, through ESP courses, or rather a combination of EAP and ESP courses. So to tie this back to assessment, what that means is if we're using exams that measure a general level of English, they're not necessarily reflecting the types of English needs that students have in EMI courses or in EME courses. But that then raises the question of, well, how do we assess this? I think that we've seen in all the presentations today, especially the presentations in this panel, that there is no one-size-fits-all implementation of EME. Ibunila pointed out that EME is not just one method, but there's many variations. And our study has shown the ways in which EMI is implemented across countries and across universities varies. So I would say that moving away from a general English test, universities should consider the specific needs of students on their programs. And those might vary by department. So those might be different for a student entering a biology program versus entering a business program. Of course, this is going to be very resource intensive. So this is a long-term goal, I think, moving universities to a form of assessment that is going to be most appropriate. I think that's a bit of a long answer, so maybe I'll stop here in case anyone else wants to add on to that.
Any other comments on that? I think I think we're at the stage where we're diagnosing issues like this well, but you make a really good point. Implementing them is complex and it's expensive and it's resource intensive. So it's easy for us to say this is what should be happening or suggest it, but for universities to be doing it is it's quite a big ask. I'm going to try and fit one more question in. Anne, can I pitch this at you first, although others might like to come in? We have a question saying, given that EME is mushrooming, do you think that more empirical research on observing EMI classes is needed to get a better understanding of how EMI is applied in higher education?
I think as the presentations today have highlighted, there is a lack of evidence of there's gaps within the research. So I think in a lot of areas, there's more research needed. For British Council, our interests are within equality, inclusion, gender, things like that, which aren't touched on in research very much within higher education, EMI in higher education. I myself am not a researcher, so I'd like to hand this question back to the researchers, if there's any kind of areas that you think research should focus on.
I was just about to ask Agatha, so that's a nice cue.
Thank you. I think we shouldn't be focusing on methodologies. We should be using all sorts of methodologies because we need insights from the kind of from all levels, meso, micro, and macro. So doing observations in the classroom is essential, but then, we can't have all of the studies looking at one particular classroom. For example, I don't know, studying business at this particular university in Indonesia. We need these happening in a lot of places. So then maybe we can have a systematic review of what the research outcomes are. Because if everybody starts doing scoping studies, we'll have too many scoping studies. If everybody starts doing the really minor, small studies spread around, we need a balance, definitely. And I guess it's easier maybe it is difficult to do it in an organized way, in a way that, for example, we'll be using the same tools in different countries, so then the data is comparable. So maybe if we have a granting funding source, or if we can set up a consortium that maybe we'll be doing the same kind of following the same steps in different countries and then doing observations in different places, that would be just ideal. But that requires a lot of time, human resources, and obviously funding. So in an ideal world, that would be the case. But even if we can have observational studies scattered around different places and then try to combine, what are the outcomes in the different contexts, that would be great too.
Absolutely, and it's we're running out of time now. It's great always to finish with the researcher saying we need more money to do the research, because that's the bit that often gets forgotten, isn't it? We need all this research. All your reports recommend let's do lots more research, and then no one actually says, well, where's the money coming from? And on that note, I'm aware we've run over time. Thank you to everyone who stayed, and particularly thank you to all our panelists. We could talk about this not just for the rest of the day, but probably for the rest of our lives. But I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. So thank you again to all of you. It's been great. Let's do it again sometime.
Thank you.
Now, I have, just to finish, a series of just very short announcements about various other conferences that are going on that you could attend. Just a reminder, first of all, if you've registered for tomorrow and the next day for the assessment workshops, they're going to start at 2 p.m. I am told. Oh, the slides are popping up. Aha, New Directions East Asia 2021. New Directions in English Language Assessment is the British Council's flagship language testing and assessment conference, and it provides perspectives and insight on trends and approaches in English language assessment at a local, regional, and international level. It was established in 2013, so New Directions East Asia 2021 will be the 9th conference. It's on December the 10th to the 11th, and there's going to be over 1,000 delegates from around East Asia and from all over the world. The theme this year is Fairer, Greener, Stronger, the Future of Language Assessment. And the conference brings together leaders in language assessment, policymakers, and educators to help inform policies and shape the partnerships needed to navigate this new challenging context that we find ourselves in because of COVID. There's plenaries, there's panel discussions, there's presentations, there'll be student awards, spotlights on different parts of East Asia, and there's pre-event workshops on classroom assessment and auto-scoring with AI, which is always interesting, and a range of academic research. There'll be lots of presentations. So there are standard and complimentary pass available for registration. Please do look it up. It's one of my favorite conferences. I hope you can join us. Then the hybrid and joint conference of, deep breath, the 20th Asia TEFL, the 68th TEFLN, and the 5th INELTAI, I think I pronounced that right, International Conference on Hindsight, Insight, and Foresight in ELT and Multilingual Asia, which is a great title. That's from the 5th to 7th of August, 2022, so it's quite a long way off. I'm not sure if details are up on the TEFLN website yet, but they will be, so do keep an eye open for that. English Score is the British Council's mobile English test. It's been used by universities and companies. There are 2 programs in Indonesia in the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. One is a talent scouting program, and one is the Directorate General of GTK, testing language proficiencies. We don't have time to discuss this in detail, but do have a look at this online. It has security features, it has a front-facing camera, and it's a very easily accessible test. Our Saturday Tech Talk this Saturday with Joe Dale and ITAL. If you're interested in exploring ways to improve your classroom interaction using technology, please do come along to that. And finally, I think, the ASEAN Teacher Webinar Series. So you can join teachers from Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, sharing best practice, looking at listening on the 23rd of November. And you can also learn about free online professional development courses from the British Council at that. So, terima kasih banyak. Thank you for joining this webinar. Remember, you need to complete the evaluation survey in order to get the link to download your e-certificate and your materials. I think someone will hopefully put the link. Here it comes, as if by magic. Com's going to put the link in. And so it's only available till 6 p.m. today. So cepatlah, nice and quick, and then you can get your certificate and your materials. So just to say thank you to all of you for joining in. It's been great to see so many people. This is the first of these that I have done, and I have to say I've learned a lot today. I hope you've all got plenty now to take away and to think about, and lots of other things now that you can be doing over the next year or so to enhance your own professional development. So thank you all again, and goodbye.